Managers in both these fields receive a management fee, typically set at 2% of the amount under management. They also receive a profits interest, typically set at 20% of the fund's profits. The profits interest is sometimes called a carried interest or simply a carry. As ordinary income. The profits interest is taxed as capital gain if and to the extent the fund itself is recognizing capital gain. If it's long-term capital gain, that's at a tax rate of 15% as opposed to the 35% maximum tax rate on ordinary income. In addition, carry is exempt from payroll tax.
Professor Bankman, I'd like to ask you about your testimony that some hedge fund managers may currently pay taxes at a lower rate than Americans who make less money. If I understand your testimony correctly, the earnings of hedge fund managers are called carried interest. Is that correct?
That's right.
And to the extent that these earnings can be tied to long-term gains, the tax rate is just 15%. Is that right?
That's right.
I just want to make sure because I thought I was hearing something different. And I want to compare that 15% tax rate to the tax rates of some other working Americans, very hard-working Americans. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has calculated the median earnings for various occupations in the American workforce. The median earnings for American school teachers were $43,000, Professor Bankman, to $49,000 per year. What is the tax rate for a school teacher with that income?
Well, if it depends on their marital status, but if they're single, the 25% rate would start at about $32,000, I believe. So they would be paying tax at 25% on that income, and there would be payroll tax they would be paying too. So it would be a 40% higher rate that is 25 as compared to 15.
Jesus Christ. The median earnings for a firefighter was $41,190. His or her tax rate would also, I think, be around that 25% range that you just talked about. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, the median hourly earnings for a plumber, I'm talking about plumbers here a lot lately, were $20.65 per hour, and that's about $41,000 per year. That's also taxed about at the 25% rate. Is that right?
That would be right. Of course, there may be deductions from that too, so we may be slightly overstating the rate on some of those cases.
Well, let me ask you this way. So Joe the plumber is being taxed at a higher rate than Joe the investment banker. Is that right? Is that a fair statement?
Well, that would be true if it were Joe the fund manager. The investment bankers actually don't get that break.
Okay. So the fund manager?
Yes.
All right. Now, Professor Bankman, does this seem fair to you?
No.
On the average, the witnesses on the next panel made over $1 billion. $1 billion in 2007. Yet at least some portion of their earnings is being taxed at just a 15% rate. Is that fair?
No, I don't believe that's either fair or efficient.
And why do you say that? Let's concentrate on the word efficient. Why do you say it's not efficient?
Well, a fundamental goal of tax policy is to try to tax everything at the same rate. Otherwise, the tax system interferes with the flow of labor, the flow of resources. So it's inefficient to give a tax break to one occupation as opposed to another. We ought to start them off at the same rate, and we can all debate what that appropriate rate is, but nobody has ever offered a reason why this one slice of highly paid professionals should be taxed at a lower rate than other slices of either highly paid or less highly paid professionals.
Is there something that makes these guys so special that they get this 15% rate? I mean, because I'm sure people like Joe the plumber and others would like to try to get into that category. I mean, is there something special about these guys?
Well,
and ladies?
The rate has a long historical explanation to it, which doesn't make hedge fund managers that benefit from the rate special, but does give a little bit of an explanation how we, to some extent, slipped into a situation where so many of our most highly paid members are getting preferential tax treatment.
Well, let me just
Is special tax treatment for hedge fund managers warranted? Well, I would only say that if Congress decides it's good policy to alter the tax treatment of carried interest, that change should apply to all partnerships, private equity, oil and gas, real estate, etc., all of which are based on that same principle, not just hedge funds. And I personally would have no objection whatever to such a change.
Each of you appearing here, my neighbor, when I was on his way to work this morning, said to me, he said, how does it feel to be going before 5 folks who have got more money than God? I'm sure you'll disagree with him. But you are private citizens, and your income is not required to be publicly disclosed. So I'm going to respect your privacy and not disclose your specific compensation. But you have provided information about your income to the committee, and it shows that although there are individual variations, on the average, each of you made more than $1 billion in 2007. I got to tell you, that is a staggering amount of money, and I'm not knocking you for it. But even though you made enormous sums, you are not taxed like ordinary citizens, like the guy that said what I told you. Your earnings are not taxed as ordinary income. Instead, the fees you receive are called carried interest, which means that they are taxed at capital gains rates. There are 2 capital gains rates, a low 15% rate for long-term gains and a higher rate for short-term gains. What this means is that to the extent your earnings are based on long-term gains, the tax rate is just 15%. My question for you is whether this is fair. A school teacher or a plumber or a policeman makes on the average of $40,000 or $50,000 to $50,000 a year. Yet they had to pay 25% tax. You make $1 billion. Yet your rate can be as low as 15%. Is that fair, Mr. Paulson? I want to start with you because I understand that a significant part of your earnings can be short-term gain, but not all of it is. And Mr. Paulson, press accounts say that you earned over $3 billion in 2007. If just 20% of your income is long-term gain, that's over $600 million in income that is being taxed at a low rate. And so would y'all start with you and just...
Well, we certainly appreciate...
I want you to keep your voice up for my questions.
Yeah, we certainly appreciate your concern for a fairness in the tax code. But I will say I believe our tax situation is fair. If your constituents, whether they're a plumber or a teacher, bought a stock and they own that stock for more than a year, they would pay a long-term capital gains rate. So for our investments, to the extent I own investments for more than a year, I also pay a long-term capital gains tax. If we own an investment for less than a year, we pay short-term capital gains, which is taxed as ordinary income. And any fee income we receive, such as management fees, for that is strictly ordinary income.
So but this is about money that you are managing for other people, it's not your money, right? In other words, you said if I hold certain things for so long, but you're actually getting paid for what you do, the work that you perform. Is that right?
The way partnership accounting works, if the partnership owns an asset for more than a year, that asset is taxed at long-term capital gains, and that tax is passed along to all the partners in the same way. If the asset in the fund, in the partnership, is a short-term capital gain, then all the partners, including the general partner, pay short-term capital gain.
Do you have an opinion, Mr. Falcone?
Yes, I do. I think that the important thing to realize that hedge funds, quite frankly, are not and probably should not be treated any differently than any other investor. And as the case may be with my particular situation, last year, approximately 98% of my taxable income was taxed under ordinary income. But I think it is important not to differentiate between hedge funds and the rest of the investment community, whether they're private equity or real estate, or even individuals or the doctor that may own his hospital and decide to sell it. So
would any of you support repealing this tax loophole and taxing your income at regular income rates? Soros?
I do.
I can't hear you.
I agree to it. I have no problem with it.
Mr. Simons?
Yeah, I said the
little louder.
carried interest portion represented by other people's money, if that were raised to higher levels, that would be okay with me.
Mr. Falcone? You just stated your position, I think, right?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Paulson?
Yeah, I would, I don't think it is a loophole. The carried interest merely passes through the nature of the income to the partners. If it's short-term capital gain, we're taxed at short-term capital gain. If it's long-term capital gain, it's taxed at long-term capital gain.
Mr. Griffin?
I think tax equity is incredibly important, and most of the income, if not all the income that I generate, is subject to either ordinary or short-term tax rates, the highest marginal rate. But if you and I were to start a restaurant together, and I was to be the chef and operator, and you were to put up the capital, even though my labor goes into making that restaurant work every day, if we sell that business 2 or 3 years down the road, I will get long-term capital gains. Our society preferences long-term capital gains from a tax perspective. And I think what we should seek to have is consistency in how we treat long-term capital gains, whether it's the hedge fund manager, the private equity manager, or the entrepreneur who starts a restaurant together.
I see my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Turney?
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, Mr. Griffin, when you use your analogy about the restaurant, when you're the chef, the money you earn for being the chef gets taxed at a regular income rate.
That's correct, sir.
When you're managing other people's money, you're in effect the chef of that process. You get taxed for those earnings at the regular income tax rate.
And management fees are taxed as ordinary income, sir.
Well, which one determines the management fees? The 1 or 2% or the 20%?
The management fees are generally taxed as ordinary income for most firms.
What are you referring to as the management fees?
The
please?
1 or 2%.
1 or 2%. Set that aside. You get 20% and the other partners get 80% of the earnings, correct?
That is correct.
You get 20% for the money for the effort you made in managing those funds and making those investments and doing that type of work. That's being the chef, not in terms of selling the product. I know what you want to do. You want to wash it all through and come out the other end. But the fact of the matter is that's compensation for your day-to-day efforts of managing those funds, is it not?
Well, let's go back to the story of the chef. The chef in his salary every year is taxed as ordinary income. But if the restaurant has capitalizable value,
but you're not selling anything when you're getting compensated for the day-to-day management efforts that you make.
If I make an investment that creates long-term capital gains, so I invest in a biotechnology company where the stock appreciates.
A good portion of that money isn't yours, right?
That's correct.
So when you get 20%, it's for investing other people's money as well as your own.
That is correct.
And some of that compensation is for your efforts in managing and investing those other monies.
That is correct.
Right. And that, my friend, I should suggest to you is what we're saying ought to be taxed as regular income.